and they struck down their protection for those workers. But the protection was simply that they should be treated like Luxembourg workers. So the import of that judgment is very, very clear. Now, if a contractor tried in Ireland to bring in workers at under the minimum wage, that would be illegal. They do it, of course, but it's illegal. Or even if they try to break the registered agreement in construction, that would be illegal. It's done all the time, but it's illegal. So they couldn't do it legally. This is absolutely the case. But the point is, there are very, very many areas in this country of industry and services that are not protected by those type of agreements, and throughout the European Union. And our point is that if that type of exploitation became commonplace, then of course it's going to put huge pressure downwards on wages and conditions, as other bosses trying to compete with people using workers from low-wage economies at low rates would be forcing down the wages of their workers. So you would have then the race to the bottom if that became commonplace. Now, the problem with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, despite its name, is that the rights are not so fundamental after all. All anybody has to do is, the Charter is an easily read document. We agree with 95% of the rights that's in it, except unfortunately, Article 52 is the small print. It says these rights are limited. And for the limitations, you have to look at one or two different guides. And one guide you look at is an official explanation that was published by the European Union in 2000, the same year as the Charter was brought out. And in explaining Article 52, this guide says limitations are made on rights according to European Union treaties. And these limitations are based on the case law of the European Court of Justice. And they actually quote from a case of 2000, where the court said, yes, there's limitation in this particular aspect. It wasn't related to workers' rights, but it was just a general principle, because of the common organisation of the market. And then they can make a limitation because the freedom of others has to be respected in asserting rights. And the European Court of Justice has found that with the common organisation of the market and respecting the freedom of others, by which that means the freedom of these contractors to establish themselves across borders, they have undercut or endorsed the undercutting of decent wages and conditions. So, unfortunately, therefore, the rights in the Charter are circumscribed and limited as interpreted by the European Court of Justice, which gave anti-worker rights judgments. So why do they say to us that going into the future that things are going to be transformed? It will be the same. So, but it's slightly worse in the sense that, in my view, it institutionalizes those type of cases by agreeing to the limitations as adjudicated upon by the European Court of Justice. I know it's a bit complicated.
It's very complicated.
It is complicated, but nevertheless, if you follow my logic,
absolutely.
And if people simply, I would urge people to read the Charter, but read Article 52, especially paragraphs 1 and 7, it's the 2007 version.
Okay.
Read the explanation, and then read Article 6 of the Treaty of the European Union, which, as amended by the Lisbon Treaty, and it won't take somebody more than 20 minutes to figure it out.
I have two more questions, actually three more questions for you, but very quickly. One of our members would like to know, what is neoliberal about the ECB meddling with interest rates in an attempt to stimulate EU economies?
Well, I mean, what neoliberalism refers to most is the boosting of the rights of big business and the market and competition at the expense of social ends, of workers' rights, wages, conditions, pensions, and public services. And which then in practice that works out massive pressure towards the privatisation of public enterprises and services. And this idea of so-called competition, by which the idea of a decent wage, a decent pension, etc., is evicted. That's the reality. Public services are victims because they want to privatise them to take profit from them. And the other idea is to try and reduce taxes as much as possible, taxes on business especially. And that means less funding then for public services for social ends. And that's one of the problems we have in this country, that the amount of tax that the corporations pay is massively lower than the vast majority of other countries in Europe. Some countries in Europe have 3 times the amount of tax. Okay. So they have better services as well because they have more funds for services. Mm-hmm. So that's the kernel of that issue really.
What would you say to anybody who A, hasn't made up their mind, or B, is probably not going to vote tomorrow, or is thinking, I won't bother?
Well, I would say a few things to try to look at some of the key arguments that have been put forward, for example in regard to ourselves. Also look at the record of those who are urging them to vote yes or no. We have a record of standing up for workers. Mm-hmm. We were the ones who exposed the horrific exploitation scandal with Gamma Construction, for example, in 2005. We have stood by working people in all circumstances as they fight for rights and so forth. So our interest is only guided by the interests of ordinary people. However, look at Fianna Fáil. Whose interests have they catered for? The speculators, the big bankers, the big developers. Can you trust them now when they say this is good for us? Look at IBEC, the big business organisation, which said in a submission to the Forum in Europe last year that Lisbon should be supported because it afforded new opportunities for in investment or involvement or whatever in services like because of the liberalisation of services like health and education. In other words, they're out for their interests as well, as indeed are some of the other forces who have been involved. And then let people decide, see the main arguments, who's putting forward, what's their interest, and then make up their minds on that.
The final question, I suppose, is a personal question. How have you found the whole thing since you were elected, and has this campaign been heavy for you? Because you've been very, I've seen you in a lot of TV interviews, You've been very forthright about your views, fair play to you, and everything like that. So, I mean, how did it go?
Well, it's been a roller coaster really. The Euro campaign was a huge campaign. We had very, very slender resources. Yet we defeated Fianna Fáil in the capital city. There was a follow-up to that then of establishing offices and staff and so on, and getting to know the routine in Strasbourg and Brussels, so a hell of a lot of travelling, a lot of movement and dislocation. And then we were plunged into this massive campaign on the Lisbon Treaty, which has been like a maelstrom, quite frankly, especially in the last 5 or 6 weeks. So we're pretty tired at the end of it, but it's important. We believe that the future direction that is involved in Lisbon is very detrimental to working people, to ordinary people throughout Europe, to peace in our world, and therefore we have a major responsibility to try and highlight that and highlight the alternative. And so after a few days rest, we'll recommence the next phase of the struggle.
Brilliant. Joe, thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.